Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the greatest last stands in human history by Kelevin. Now this was a recommendation from one of our wonderful patrons, so thank you so much for all of the support on Patreon. Now I haven't watched this channel before, and I have no idea what last stands we're going to be talking about, but I am excited to get into it. Before I do, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Don Alejo Garza Tamez was born in July 1933 in Allende, Nuevo Leon, a town in northern Mexico. Don Alejo's family ran a sawmill, and he was raised learning the trade and slowly expanding his property, eventually buying a ranch. But in 2010, Don Alejo's ranch had the misfortune of existing in an area that would be a great checkpoint for the drug trade.
I will say, we're starting off very recent. Pretty recent for one of the greatest last stands of human history, but I'm ready to see it.
Thus drawing the attention of the Los Zetas gang.
Uh-oh.
The Los Zetas are a cartel gang known for, they were not nice people.
Yeah, the cartels, you can go down a list of just about the most horrific crimes you can think of, and the cartels have probably done most of them. Not a nice collection of individuals, you could put it that way.
They were a former Mexican military that was trained to be a task force against the cartels, but then they realized they could make a lot more money by joining the drug trades.
Yeah, that highlights the fact that a lot of successive leaders in Mexico, not that I'm incredibly read up on contemporary Mexican politics, but a lot of successive leaders have failed to deal with the cartels, even if they were trying, and you could argue that some of them weren't making much of an effort. There is also some conflicts of interest occasionally. You know, the cartels, they do make a lot of money, even if it's not benefiting your average citizen of the country.
So that leads us to where we are today. On the 13th of November 2010, the cartel approached Don Alejo and asked him very nicely and not at all threateningly to vacate the premises in 24 hours in a real estate deal in which they would pay nothing in exchange for getting to live another day. Honestly, not the worst real estate offer I've heard of. Pretty generous. I would have taken it. But Don Alejo was a principled old man, 77 years old and the absolute pinnacle of humanity. This man hit him with the "I'll be waiting," and then the cartel just left and prepared to come back with backup.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those old guys where this is his property, this is his home, he's been here for years, there's no shot he's leaving, right? Not to paint myself as too much of a coward, but if I was offered that deal, you know, with my whole life ahead of me, I'd probably take it. You know, I'm not going to give my life to defend this. But this guy's been here his whole life. He probably doesn't have much longer left anyway. He's one of these hard-nosed old-timers. He's going to stay there and defend his property.
Don Alejo calmly grabbed his collection of guns and set them up at each window of the house.
Oh.
Within 24 hours, the cartel arrived. Don Alejo told them to leave, and they shot at him. So immediately, he shot the two closest gangsters, and the firefight commenced.
Damn.
The cartel began opening fire on Don Alejo's house, shooting at the window that he fired from. Except that he had already moved to another window, and shot two more gangsters dead. And as they shifted to that window, he was already gone, moving from window to window. Eventually, the cartel got sick of it and kicked open the door, only to see him there, guns in hand. They were wounded, but not killed. The cartel just...
Damn, dude. Bro had his Red Dead Redemption John Marston moment, except, spoilers, he survived. At least for now.
Thought enough was enough, and they started using just grenades on Don Alejo's house.
Jesus!
After blowing up a bunch of stuff, they retreated before the military could arrive. And about an hour later, the military did show up, and they found the aftermath of the firefight. Over 900 bullets were fired into Don Alejo's house, and multiple just complete craters from grenades were found. Sadly, the man was found dead in his bathroom.
Damn.
Rifle still pointing to the door as he succumbed to the bullet wounds he received during the firefight.
I guess that's what makes it a last stand.
But still, he's an absolute legend. I don't usually cover recent stuff, but this was just too good. Sempronius Densus. The story of Sempronius Densus is less a story about him and more a story about Rome during a period of time in which Rome was at its most Roman.
Okay.
If you get what I mean. It was the year 69 AD. This wasn't just funny due to the number, but also that Rome decided to go through 4 emperors in a single year.
Yep.
Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian.
Yeah, this is one of those eras of Roman history that was incredibly chaotic. Now, to be fair, if you're looking at the Roman Empire, I'd say it's more often chaotic than not. It's more like chaos, infighting, civil war is the norm, and then you have a couple eras of relative peace and stability, right? Augustus's reign is one of those. This is one of those sort of common eras of chaos, going through all these emperors in rapid succession, a lot of infighting.
To begin with, I think it's safe to say that most people probably have a grasp of how Nero was as an emperor.
Mm-hmm.
He was psychotic and unhinged. He did some weird stuff involved killing his wife and replacing her with a dude that looked like her. And that's just one of the many, many stories of Nero's unhingedness.
Yeah, okay. Here's what I will say, and I'm not stepping up to defend Nero. He was certainly a bad guy. But when we think about history, we got to think about the sources from which we get that history, right? So who was writing the history about Nero? Largely the senatorial class at the time, that class of elites at the top of society. And Nero had particular beef with those guys, right? And so when they wrote about him in the most disparaging way possible, right? So a lot of the stories we have about Nero are probably exaggerations or entirely apocryphal, right? Made up. Now, that's not to say they all were. I'm sure some were true, and he probably was a bad guy, but there's some evidence to suggest that he wasn't nearly as hated by the general public as he was by that elite senatorial class. So just keep that in mind. Once again, I'm not defending the guy. He probably was bad, but a lot of the stuff you've heard about him is likely made up or exaggerated beyond the point of recognition.
I could go through tons of stories about Nero, but all you really need to know is that he was hated by most of Rome by the time he was dethroned. And the first person to take his place was a silly little guy named...
I mean, he definitely became very unpopular as you go, but once again, we are getting that from very biased sources, so it's kind of hard to tell.
Galba. Galba's first action as the self-proclaimed emperor was to march on Rome to claim his throne, as Galba was nowhere near Rome when Nero died. When Galba reached Rome, he had every soldier in the Roman garrison, unarmed or otherwise, killed.
Damn.
Which immediately did not make him very popular. Otho, a governor at the time, who had sided with Galba, began to see that he was slowly losing favor by making more and more drastic mistakes. His fall was imminent, and Galba was the most unpopular with the military, while Otho was really popular after befriending many of the Praetorian Guards over the years, even going as far as to settle one of their debts with his own money.
Hey, I'll say, if you're looking for the source of a lot of political instability throughout Roman history, you can look at the Praetorian Guard, right? Essentially, your palace guard. You've got a version of these in many different empires and states throughout history, but these guys are often involved in palace intrigue, court intrigue, and more often than not, they would be the ones to, well, I guess the metaphor is pull the trigger, in this case, unsheath the sword and take out, an emperor or a contender to be emperor or threaten someone, right? These guys had a lot of influence due to the standing and the position they were in.
Eventually, Otho knew his time had come, and so with the help of the Praetorian Guard and some other fed-up Romans, he marched on Rome, causing a riot to break out. Galba and his heir went out into the crowd to try and reassure them and calm them down, and he was surrounded by guards. But when the guards saw Otho and his militia making their way through the crowd, every single one of them abandoned Galba. All except one. Yup, that's right, 7 paragraphs in, and I'm now bringing up Sempronius Densus.
Okay.
He's incredibly uninteresting as a person, but his final act here is just absolutely legendary. Sempronius refused to allow the militia to pass, and he held his ground against the soldiers who all wanted to kill Galba. Sempronius stood alone and defended Galba to the end. Unfortunately, we have no idea how long he fought for, or if he even killed anyone at all, but goddamn was he brave. He was noted and remembered for this act of valor, despite his idea to sacrifice himself for a pretty mid-emperor, all things considered. Granted, Galba didn't even serve a year. Pretty unfortunate, but hey, you gotta do what you gotta do.
Yeah, pretty cool. I don't know if I'd class it as one of the greatest last stands in human history. More of a mid-tier last stand for a fairly bad emperor, in my opinion.
Okay, this next one is completely insane. We're talking about Vito Bertoldo. So this guy was a soldier in World War II. He was 25 when Pearl Harbor happened, and he decided to join the military despite his poor eyesight disqualifying him from the draft. His eyesight made him unable to be put into combat roles, but after requesting a transfer from his current job as a military police, he was given the role of a cook on the front lines in France. And while at a command post, he was volunteered as a guard. It was there when he noticed a group of Germans approaching off in the distance.
Uh-oh.
And so he ran out into the streets with his gun and set himself up as the sole defensive line. For the next half a day, he stood fighting off the approach by himself while being shot at with everything from pistols to tanks.
Damn.
Yeah, that's right. Tanks. Plural. As in, for 12 hours, this dude stood out in the open with his guns, fighting off soldiers and multiple tanks.
This one is pretty legendary, okay? Now, any sort of great last stand is impressive. I feel like a lot of those greatest last stands happen to be earlier in history, right? Because it's easier as an individual to hold out against a bunch of dudes with swords rather than a bunch of dudes with guns and tanks. Both are difficult, but this is virtually impossible, to be one individual managing to survive through this. So this definitely is a legendary one.
Who were shelling the area around him with 8mm guns. You know, the guns designed to take down airplanes and other tanks. All those guns firing at a single guy. Just had to hammer home how impressive that is. After the 12 hours passed, Vito ran back inside the command post and took cover behind a table with his machine gun. From there, he fired through a window to hit oncoming enemies. But then one of the tanks shot a shell into the room, which sent him flying.
No.
But this dude was hacking or something, because he got back up and picked up his gun as 2 APCs and a tank rolled up on him. He waited for an opening before peeking out the window again and firing as the soldiers jumped out of the APCs and the tank fired at him.
Damn.
It's said that he mowed down 20 combatants here alone. Much later, the command post was finally changed to another building, as the tanks just kept pummeling the area. Vito stayed behind to cover everyone and remained watching their flank for the entire night. The morning after, he swapped over to a different building, the command post of a different battalion, and spent the next 24 hours defending that area. So, to recap, he's already been up for 24 hours straight fighting and dodging tanks. You think it's bad having to wake up early for school? Imagine how much infinitely more tired you'd be in this guy's shoes.
He's still alive for now.
Vito then fought off a tank, 2 heavy artillery guns, and 15 German infantry.
Jesus.
It's said that the mobile artillery gun, which is more or less a tank, basically stuffed its barrel into the building that Vito was in and fired, sending him to the ground and messing up his allies. Then a team of friendly bazookas set the artillery truck on fire as Vito stood up and shot the people operating the flaming vehicle. Just such an insane guy. Then someone in charge finally got the bright idea to evacuate at night, but before they could put the plan to work, another assault started with ranged artillery and more tanks. So Vito's going on 48 hours of no sleep, and he begins fighting the attackers with white phosphorus grenades.
Oh my god.
Which made them stop advancing, because if you know anything about white phosphorus, it's that you don't want to be anywhere near it.
Nasty, nasty stuff.
So the attacking soldiers made the smart decision to not walk into the white fog of death. So Vito holds the angle with his gun, and a tank shot at his location, sending him flying as it destroys his gun.
Oh my
But
god.
Vito still got back up and grabbed a new gun and fought to cover the withdrawal.
This guy has handled so many almost direct-on explosions. Like, it is insane that he has lived for this long.
His comrades again. And finally, after all this,
There's like, when you talk about last stands, there's sort of 2 kinds. One is you just take out a tremendous amount of enemies. The other is you survive a tremendous amount of time, right? Now this guy, I mean, he's taken out a lot of enemies, but frankly, the real impressive part here is how long he's managed to survive under all of that enemy fire.
happens, he makes his way out, the last one to leave. I'm speechless. Never in my life have I seen someone roll so many consecutive nat 20s.
Ha!
Like,
True.
how did this man do it? I'm not kidding, this guy was absolutely nuts.
My man had a crazy dexterity rating.
Alright, these next 2 are probably...
Did he live? So did he live through that? That's what I'm getting. I hope he lived through the war. That'd be bananas.
Most popular, and considering how similar they are, they're gonna be together as the epitome of fighting until the very last breath.
Okay.
First up is the Viking of Stamford Bridge.
Yeah, this is a very famous one. So I hadn't heard of the stories up until this point. I'm a little familiar with Galba and Otho, but I don't remember hearing that story individually. Maybe I had about that last stand. This one's famous. I've heard of this one, of course.
So around 1066, Harald Hardrada of Norway was invading England to take it from the current king, Harold Godwinson. And the most extraordinary battle was in Stamford Bridge. Which,
Of
ironically,
course, it's funny because, in the end, well, this all ends up with William the Conqueror marching on in and taking over and changing the face of England, the British Isles, right? Forever. It's a pretty consequential moment.
was not the name of the bridge, but rather the name of the village that they fought in. Anyway, the fight was a losing battle for the Vikings. They retreated across a bridge, and one Viking remained, standing upon it, wielding a Dane axe. The English tried to fight him, but every person on the front line was killed by the Viking. Every wave introduced more and more Englishmen fighting on the bridge. But the Viking...
and this really fits into a certain archetype of this era, the archetype of sort of the strong Viking berserker, whether literally a berserker or more figuratively, who can take out dozens of Englishmen on his own, right? Like I said, this is sort of a popular archetype of this era, and this might be one of the most famous moments of that archetype at play.
The Dane axe just continued to cut them down. 40 men attempted to cross the bridge, and 40 men failed. This random Viking was only stopped when an English soldier snuck underneath the bridge and stabbed him with a spear.
Those sneaky English.
Which killed him. That Viking's death led to the invading force being routed, and the English won. But their pride was heavily...
For now. And I will say, I was talking about the two different types of last stands. This is a last stand that's impressive because of the sheer number of men he managed to kill. Holding out for a certain period of time, of course. But this is one about, wow, look at all the enemies you managed to take out.
Bruised. One guy killing 40 dudes, that's just embarrassing. This battle was especially amazing because it's remembered due to a fight on a bridge, but the village nearby was named Stamford Bridge. The two leaders were named Harold and Harold, and the lone Viking is called the Viking of Stamford Bridge, which really does not help with clarity, because is he the Viking of the bridge or the Viking of the town who died on a bridge in Stamford Bridge? But anyway, just something to think about. This whole Viking on the bridge thing is very similar to another story about a monk named Benkei. Benkei was a monk in the late 1180s, serving a samurai named Yoshitsune. There's a whole veritable feast of history between these two, but in Benkei's final moments, much like the Viking in Stamford 100 years earlier, it took place on a bridge. Yoshitsune was...
look, if you're going for a last stand and you're outnumbered greatly, a bridge is a good place to be. You know what I mean? You can hold off a lot of enemies because there's a very narrow corridor they can walk through, right? The bridge limits. It's a choke point, essentially. This is also why I said earlier, a bunch of guys with swords, they gotta come over the bridge. Now, still leaves you open to archers or spears or whatever, but fast forward, you're standing on a bridge with a gun. They can just shoot you from across the bridge or blow up the bridge, you know what I mean?
To his castle to commit seppuku, and he needed time. So Benkei bought him that time by guarding the bridge as hundreds of samurai approached. The story goes that Benkei remained on the bridge with his Nagakiba at the ready. Wave after wave of samurai charged against him. Legend has it that he killed 500 samurai before they decided to...
Okay, well, this is why we say legend has it, because there's no shot that's real. I'll take somewhere between 40 and 500. You know what I mean? 40? That may even be exaggerated with the story of the Viking. Okay, that could have happened. 500? No shot. But a lot, sure.
Just shoot Benkei with arrows. Yeah, these old last stands are always really embellished. But
right.
Anyway, after however many samurai actually died, they decided to be cautious and to shoot arrows at Benkei instead.
That is worth pointing out that probably most of the stories we're seeing today, maybe not all, but most, are probably incredibly exaggerated, embellished. Even if something similar to this did happen, you're talking about jacking up, the amount of men involved, the number of people killed, the amount of time that the individual held out, all those sorts of things. Jacked up to make it seem more impressive, though the original event may still be quite impressive on its own.
Benkei remained standing despite being a pincushion of arrows, so the samurai didn't approach anymore. Eventually, after some waiting, they did approach the bridge to see that he had propped himself up on his weapon and was long dead. Which brought Yoshitsune enough time to commit seppuku, so... W friend, I guess.
I guess. How long does committing seppuku take? I would have thought he didn't need that much time.
This next one's a fun one. We're going to need to go back over 1,000 years before Benkei and the Viking of Stamford Bridge.
Okay.
Agis III. Agis III was the son of the king of Sparta, Archimedes III. And he'd witnessed Sparta's decline in both power and social standing. Agis' father left Greece to fight against Macedonia, which was Alexander the Great's kingdom, along with fighting a few other Greek city-states. Archimedes did this after he and Agis fought off the Thebans just a decade earlier in some weird father-son bonding experience in which they tried to regain Sparta's lost land. Anyway, all that aside, but then Archimedes did the dad thing, and he went off on his own to find the illustrious pack of cigarettes, which means he became a mercenary commander, and when he saw the size difference between his army and the Macedonians, he dipped out, saying something like, "You guys got this, I gotta go grab a drink, be right back." And then he just vanished.
He went out to go buy some milk, and he hasn't come back yet. Strange.
We find out later that he was killed the same day when he was caught in another battle.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, so Agis had been holding down the house, keeping it tidy for when his dad came back with the cigarettes that he'd promised, but instead he got a knock on the door. It was a messenger, telling him that his father passed away in a tragic cigarette-related four-car pileup, and now he owned the house and had to pay taxes.
Damn.
I don't think this bit's making any sense. Okay.
Testing out your stand-up bit in the middle of a history video.
Wait, scratch all of that. Okay, anyway, Agis was king and Archidamus was dead. That's all you need to know. And so Sparta's land was divided up to its neighbors and enemies. Agis knew that it would take time for Sparta to recover, so he bided his time and waited for Macedonia to drop its guard. He sent out messengers to speak with various Persian military leaders, contractors, and even the king himself, asking for military supplies and asking them to attack Greece. The Persians did not need to be asked twice, and so they did, which marked the beginnings of a new war against Macedonia. 2 years later, Agis and...
I mean, you're looking at two of the big, not empires, but I guess sort of civilizations of this era. You're talking about the Greek states, right? That, were at times more united than others, and at times, like under Alexander, all the territory in the region was united under him. But you talk about these Greek states, a sort of ancient Greek civilization, and you talk about the Persians, right? Very powerful in their own right. Of course, like we said, under Alexander, he conquered just about everything you could imagine in the region. But that was not usually the case. Persians and the Greeks were often more rivals.
And some other Greek kingdoms who were opposed to Macedonian rule declared war against Alexander's kingdom, which is Macedonia. And after a successful battle, Agis moved forward to siege the great city of Megalopolis, which is where Agis made his last stand. Unfortunately for Agis, the city held against the siege, and a relief army made its way to battle Agis. The battle was lost, and he was wounded. While he and his men were retreating and they were carrying him, he realized he was dead weight, and so he told his men to leave him and retreat faster. Staying behind, unable to stand, he fought on his knees and killed a few of the approaching Macedonians.
All right.
Eventually, he was killed by a javelin. And like so many other stories of last stands, his life was cut short by a sneak attack or a thing he couldn't reasonably defend himself from.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised how many last stand stories end that way, at least in the ancient world.
It's not that surprising. I mean, one, you got a dude who's fighting off all attackers. An easy way to get him, or an easier way to get him, is with some sort of sneak attack, ranged attack. Also, if we want to talk on a more sort of literary level, if you remember that a lot of these stories are exaggerated, crafted into stories from maybe some real event that happened, it does sort of fit with the narrative that, well, this guy was fighting off all these enemies, he couldn't be stopped, the only thing that could stop him was a sneaky attack from the side or something like that, something he couldn't see coming. It sort of preserves the integrity of the last stand, like no one could fairly beat him in combat, right? So if you remember that some of these stories are exaggerated and crafted until they're more fiction than non-fiction, then that sort of plays into it as well.
Okay, now we're talking about Roy Benavidez. So this man was a staff sergeant in the Vietnam War.
Okay.
And he has a really cool story.
We've had a surprising amount of relatively modern last stands. To be honest, I thought we were going to mainly be talking about ancient history, or maybe ancient to medieval, but we've had a couple that are from, World War II or afterwards.
But to keep it simple, this guy was made of tough stuff. He was undercover and he stepped on a landmine, and then he got rescued and sent to a hospital where he would, against doctor's orders, crawl across the ground and try to lift himself up against a wall.
Wow.
And he just did that until he could walk again. Yeah,
Damn.
This guy just speed ran recovery so he could get back to Vietnam. 2 years later.
The only guy, I think. I mean, Vietnam was an extremely brutal conflict. You're fighting there as a soldier. Most of them absolutely did not want to be there. You know, I mean, you step on a landmine, that was a fairly common occurrence. Seems like he managed to retain his legs and walk. A lot of people lost their legs. Most people, they would not want to return, right, to this terrible, terrible conflict. I guess Roy here, he was an outlier.
Now in 1968, Roy was in a forward operating base in Loch Ninh. Recently, a 12-man Special Forces recon team was dropped into a jungle west of the Loch Ninh area. They were pinned down and needed extraction, but the helicopters weren't able to land due to the hail of gunfire being laid down on them. And so Roy hears this distress call over the radio, and he saw the helicopters landing at the base to refuel, so he immediately volunteers to go help in a second extraction attempt. The 12-man team was either dead or wounded, and they needed help fast. Keep in mind that Roy was also part of this battle, so Roy got into the helicopter and they flew over. When they got to the 12-man team, the helicopter got as close as it could, and Roy jumped out and sprinted to the team. While doing so, he took a bullet to his right leg and a bullet hit his helmet. Upon reaching the group of injured soldiers, he proactively took charge and helped to pinpoint where the team should focus their gunfire. He then threw a few smoke grenades to alert the helicopter of his and the rest of the team's position. He shot some suppressing fire at the enemies while the other guys extracted, and he then searched for and found the dead squad leader's body and classified documents on it, which would not have been good if they fell into enemy hands. As he was carrying the body to safety, he was shot in the abdomen, and a grenade exploded, sending shrapnel into his back. While that was happening, he also saw the helicopter pilot get shot and crash with everyone inside.
Okay, wow. I thought the story was about to be Roy gave his life and these guys managed to escape. The whole thing just got a lot worse.
So immediately he secured the documents and sprinted to the downed helicopter and pulled people out of the wreckage to create defensive perimeter, entrenching everyone in a safer but unsustainable defensive position.
Right.
And so while the enemy fired upon the group, Roy was making sure everyone was holding up as he called in airstrikes to make another extraction attempt possible. But as he was doing that, another few bullets hit him in the thigh while he was fixing up the injuries of another team member.
This guy is just riddled with bullets and shrapnel.
But that did not stop him. Just as the new extraction helicopter landed, Roy, one by one, carried the injured soldiers to the aircraft.
He carried them? God damn, they must have been worse off than him then.
He did it in multiple trips, and his second trip had him ambushed by an enemy soldier who he fought and killed with a knife, but not before sustaining a bayonet wound or two.
Jesus.
Just as we go along, keep track of his injuries in your head. He's been shot a few times, stabbed a few times, and he's got some shrapnel in him.
Yep.
As he carried the last of the men to the helicopter, he saw two men approaching. And so he killed them before checking to see if all classified information and injured people were collected. And then he passed out from the pain and was dragged onto the helicopter.
God damn.
He managed to save 8 men after sustaining 37 bullet, shrapnel, and bayonet wounds.
Jesus.
He was so exhausted and bloody that his eyes had fused shut. He was presumed dead, but as the doctor was zipping the body
Presumed dead? He wasn't?
bag, he spat into the doctor's face to prove he was still alive. What a goddamn legend.
So, I find myself wondering about the aftermath. Like, did this guy survive? Did he survive the Vietnam War? That's an incredible amount of damage to take.
Stories are just so unreal. In fact, when Roy received his Medal of Honor, Ronald Reagan even said that if it were a movie, I would not believe it. Which just shows how nuts life can get, especially in do-or-die situations. Anyway, subscribe.
Alright. Well, there you go. That was an interesting video. If you enjoyed it, hey, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. We got to see some of our greatest last stands in human history. Like I said, I was surprised by how many were from relatively recent history. But of course, there's a whole lot more last stands to draw from throughout human history. They are very entertaining stories, as long as you keep in mind that most of these, even the modern ones, are probably over-exaggerated, partly fictionalized, and especially the more ancient stories, sometimes they may be entirely or almost entirely fictionalized, so, you know, just keep that in mind. But, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff. So, yeah, hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you again next time. Goodbye.